You're listening to Near FM 101.6 in Dublin, and we're going to talk to Professor Noam Chomsky today. It is very difficult to introduce someone like Noam Chomsky, because if I were to do a complete introduction, it would be longer than the interview. His academic achievements, his books in his own field of linguistics as well as politics, his interviews on audio and video, and his talks all around the world are all well documented elsewhere. However, for me, the most important aspects of Chomsky's character have always been his humanity, his uncompromising commitment to absolute truth, and his unceasing support for the underdog. For half a century now, he has been on the forefront of dissidence, never shying away from a position because of its unpopularity, and always consistent in his arguments. He has spent time in prison during the Indochina Wars, has been on the FBI's list of enemies of the state, and has been slandered by academics, propagandists, and all manners of apologists for state power. They have tried to ignore him, marginalize him, and isolate him, as well as resorting to outright lies and deception to discredit him. Despite all this, today, more and more people turn to him for an accurate analysis of world events. This is due to a consistent rejection of state violence and state power all around the world. Frequently, when his opponents reach the realization that they cannot argue against him with facts or logic, they accuse him of supporting the enemies of the US. A cursory look at Chomsky's work shows the absurdity of this argument. He has always stated the truth in every case while pointing out that it is easy to criticize one's enemy's crimes, but it achieves little. On the other hand, where individuals can exert some meaningful influence is on their own government, which could in turn bring about significant relief to the victims. This is particularly important in the West, where there are considerable limits on state power in comparison to the rest of the world. Another observation regarding Chomsky's writings is that it paints a very depressing picture of the world. I'm going to quote Chomsky himself here, which has inspired me for many, many years. He says, "Optimism is a strategy for making a better future, because unless you believe that the future can be better, it is unlikely that you will step up and take responsibility for making it so. If you assume that there is no hope, you guarantee that there will be no hope. If you assume that there is an instinct for freedom and there are opportunities to change things, there is a chance that you may contribute to making a better world. The choice is yours." I want to start with the question on media. I'm talking to you from Near FM 101.6 Northeast Access Radio, which is a community-based radio station in northeast of Dublin. We're obviously slightly different. You, with Professor Herman in your book Manufacturing Consent, you were talking about a propaganda model. I wonder if you could talk a few minutes about that, maybe.
Well, the propaganda model, which I should incidentally say is mostly Ed Herman's work, which is why his name comes first in the book. It's simply a discussion of the institutional structure of the corporate media and the general social economic system in which they're embedded. And from it, we identify a number of factors which one could predict would influence media content, framing of issues, selection of issues, and so on. And then most of the book is just an investigation, and we've written a lot about this elsewhere too, individually and together, seeing if those factors do in fact have a predictive force in accounting for what does appear, what doesn't appear, is presented, and so on and so forth. The factors are pretty obvious. One of them is just ownership. The media, we're talking about primarily the U.S., not very different elsewhere. The media are corporate entities, parts of much larger corporations, sometimes huge ones. They're like other businesses. They sell a product to a market. The market in this case is other businesses, namely advertisers, and the product is readers and listeners. Now, we happen to be concentrating mostly on the elite media, the ones that more or less set the agenda for others. So in the United States, that would be the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on, smaller newspapers, and just essentially pick up the framework that they impose. So we're looking at the elite media, let's say the New York Times, which sells to a market, the market being businesses, and the product that it sells is what's sometimes called the political class, relatively privileged people who are in the one or another kind of managerial post, educational, cultural, political, government, business, and so on. So you have major corporations selling elite, educated, privileged sectors to other businesses. So one question is, what would you expect to come out of such a system? Pretty obvious picture of the world that conforms to their interests and concerns. And then there are several other factors. There are powerful pressure systems, like the government has an enormous influence on shaping news and interpretation and so on, and does it in all kinds of ways. There are pressure. I won't run through it, but a series of other factors of that kind which interact to give a prediction as to what the media content will be like. And then, as I say, most of our work, almost all of it, is just devoted to testing this in what we try to find the hardest cases and show that it works in those. And I think it gives a reasonably good, in fact, very good prediction. In fact, sometimes the facts go beyond what we would have predicted. So that's the basic framework of the study.
Right. This brings us to another question on the moral justification of the conflict and war and whatever. In your book, Rethinking Camelot, you're quoting military historian Geoffrey Parker, and he's saying that it was thanks to their military superiority rather than any social, moral, or natural advantage that the white peoples of the world managed to create and control their global hegemony. And this is very interesting, obviously, the use of media and the cultural managers, the intelligentsia, as you have pointed out, in justifying wars, both retrospectively and before they start, and military conflicts around the world, that would allow those in control of society, the various administrations and governments, to perpetuate this system. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
I should make it clear that he is a military historian. He's talking about the history of war and the particular form of savagery that developed within Europe, which was a very brutal and violent region for hundreds of years, that he argues essentially enabled them to conquer the world through technology and so on, but just a culture of savagery developed internally. So as he puts it, he says that for Europeans, science became war became a science.
That's right.
For others, it was a pastime. And you're asking a question about the contemporary period, where I think it's quite appropriate. So let's take the major issue of war that's discussed right now, the war in Iraq. Well, the media coverage in the United States, and to the extent that I read it in England and on the continent, is very narrowly framed. Actually, I had an interview with a Polish journalist about this a couple of weeks ago, and I just asked him whether he had been reading Pravda during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And he just laughed because he saw the point of the question immediately. The coverage in the West of the war in Iraq is very much the same as the coverage of the war of Afghanistan in Pravda. If you read Pravda, there were criticisms of the war. It was costing too much. It was badly planned. The leadership didn't think in advance of how to deal with the situation. Too many Russian soldiers are dying. They're having a terrible time bringing the benefits of Russian civilization and so on to the backward Afghans, as they'd hoped to do with their benign intentions, because they're being harassed by terrorists and insurgents and so on. In fact, it's virtually the same as what you get in the Western press concerning Iraq. It's treated about at the level of a school newspaper discussing its own football team or something like that. You don't ask the question whether they should win. That's just taken for granted. You ask the question, how are we doing? Do we need a different coach? Did he make a mistake? Too many players getting injured and so on. That's the frame in which the war in Iraq is discussed. Now, of course, when the West discussed the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, that wasn't the frame at all. In fact, it was discussed as it should be. It's an invasion. That's aggression. That's a major war crime. The question isn't how can the Russians win, but why should they be there at all? And there was no hesitation about attributing to them objectives, actually, well beyond the truth, in fact, about trying to gain control of the oil of the Gulf and so on and so forth. But it was possible to attribute to them strategic and economic objectives, whether rightly or not, in pursuing the war. Well, all of those questions are off the agenda when it's a Western war, U.S.-British war in this case. Then you do not raise the crucial question. The crucial question is, the crucial issue is, what's the justification for aggression? That this is aggression is not even a question. Take a look at the Nuremberg Tribunal definitions, or accepted by the General Assembly, the UN, and so on. Yeah, this is an outright case of aggression. It's what was called at Nuremberg the supreme international crime, which includes within it all of the evil that follows. All. Abu Ghraib, the insurgency, the massacre, the war crimes that the U.S. committed in Fallujah, on and on. The terrible effects on the society, all of that is included in the supreme international crime of aggression, for which Nazi war criminals were hanged. And they were hanged to the accompaniment of the very eloquent words by the chief counsel, Justice for the prosecution, Justice Jackson, the U.S. chief counsel, who expressed very clearly the conclusion that we must make certain that the crimes for which we are punishing the present accused are crimes that apply to the principles apply to everyone. And if we ever carry out such crimes, we must be subjected to the same penalties. He said that we are handing them what he called a poison chalice, and if we sip from it, we have to suffer the same fate. Well, that can't even be discussed in the West. Can you even raise that question? The only question is, well, how do we win? Another question that cannot be raised, except way on the margins, is why did the U.S. and Britain invade? We know the official reasons. The first pretext was they invaded on what they both called the single question. Will Saddam give up his weapons of mass destruction? All right, after a few months after the invasion, the single question got an answer. He didn't have any, and didn't have any programs. So very quickly, the leadership changed the purpose of the invasion. It wasn't to look for weapons of mass destruction. It was President Bush's messianic mission, as it's called in the press, to bring democracy to Iraq and to the Middle East and to the world. I've reviewed not only media, but also scholarship, and it's uniform. After that became the official mission, it just became a kind of a divine truth. Every scholarly article on the Bush Doctrine, every discussion of Iraq begins by saying, well, the president is dedicated to bringing democracy to Iraq and to the world and so on. And then sometimes there come criticisms. It's beyond their reach, or they're not ready for it, or something like that. But that is the goal, is accepted with virtual uniformity. And the only evidence for it is that the president pronounced it. In fact, it's very much like North Korea. If the dear leader pronounces something, everyone has to accept it. You take a look at the evidence, overwhelmingly against it, but the evidence is just dismissed. Okay, that's real obedience. And it continues like that. What you cannot say is what we're allowed to say when the Russians invade Afghanistan. In this case, it's kind of obvious. They invaded Iraq because they got the second largest oil resources in the world. It's right at the center. They're very easily accessible. It's right at the center of the world's major energy-producing region. Success in Iraq, meaning establishing an obedient client state with military bases and so on, would greatly enhance U.S. Control over the world's energy resources and would provide leverage over others. Occasionally this is mentioned. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the more astute of the planners, did mention that success in imposing U.S. domination in Iraq, what will be called democracy, success would provide the U.S. with critical leverage over European and Asian competitors, the other major economies. That's actually a principle that goes way back to the 1940s. It's very explicit in internal documents. Controlling Middle East oil would give the U.S. what was called veto power over others, meaning other industrial powers. But we're not allowed to discuss those things. I mean, they're off the agenda, just as the question of whether what you do when people carry out the supreme international crime, what you do in that case, that's off the agenda. The only question is, how can we win? How can we do better? Even the discussions of withdrawal, there's a great deal of discussion of, should the U.S. withdraw, how should it withdraw, and so on. There are a few things missing from that discussion. One thing missing from the discussion is that an overwhelming majority of the people of Iraq, 87%, according to the latest U.S. studies, want a firm timetable for withdrawal. They want us out. Well, Blair and Bush both make it very explicit that there will be no timetable for withdrawal. Well, in part, that's just the normal hatred for democracy on the part of powerful groups. It's expected. But there's more to it than that. And that's what we're not allowed to discuss. There's a reason why they can't withdraw and don't want to withdraw and fight desperately not to. And that is that a sovereign Iraq, which is more or less democratic, could turn into the ultimate nightmare for Washington to talk about it, but it's pretty obvious when you think about the policies they're likely to pursue. However, we can't discuss that because that would mean opening the door to the idea that our leaders are capable of pursuing rational strategic and economic interests, and that can't be. It must be that they are noble and benign and occasionally make mistakes, and now they made a terrible mistake. That's the only way we're allowed to discuss our own states. We can discuss other states, particularly enemy states, in rational terms, but not our own. It's overwhelmingly true. The same was true of the war in Vietnam, Reagan's horrendous terrorist wars in Central America, case after case. And it's very striking right now in the case of Iraq.
And that brings us to another question, the possible expansion of this war, this nuclear dispute with Iran, and the interesting contrast with North Korea. I wonder, could you talk a few minutes on that?
Well, there's a similarity. In both cases, when the Bush administration came in, there had been progress towards in fact, North Korea had stopped working on developing nuclear weapons, as far as anyone knows. Within a framework agreement that was established, it was a bargain on both sides. North Korea would stop its nuclear weapons work. The United States would call off hostile threats, would provide them with a reactor for nuclear reactor for power, would provide fuel, and so on. I mean, that was essentially the bargain. It wasn't kept, but it was at least more or less in place. When the Bush administration came in, they just canceled the bargain, immediately issued hostile threats, terminated the promised supplies and aid, and so on. Yeah, not surprisingly, North Korea returned to, pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and returned to developing nuclear weapons. Well, they apparently have them, which is a deterrent. which is what they're for. And it's making the U.S. cautious about any actions because they have a deterrent. Let's take Iran. As far as anyone knows, just to be clear about this, back in the 1970s, the United States was strongly supporting the development of nuclear power in Iran.
That's right.
Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, was explaining that they need nuclear power because they ought to use their oil for other purposes. My own university, MIT, over enormous student protest, was training Iranian nuclear engineers, being subsidized substantially by the Shah. So then they needed nuclear power. Those are the same programs they're carrying out now. And now it's intolerable. Then we were supporting it and backing it. The difference is that then they were an ally. And now they're not an ally. So they don't need nuclear power anymore. So that's point number one. Point number two is that as far as we know, Iranian actions are within the legal framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Maybe they're not. Maybe there's something secret, or we don't know. But as far as is known, that's all there is. They offered in 2003, May 2003, Iran offered to discuss with the United States all issues, including nuclear power, threats, the security threats to them, which are very severe. After all, the U.S. is threatening them with attack and has been for years. It has troops on major military forces on all their borders. Israel's threatening attack. Those are serious security issues. So Iran was proposed to discussing all of these issues, including the nuclear and the uranium enrichment. Well, the U.S. just refused, wouldn't discuss it. The next thing that happened is that the European Union and Iran entered into discussion about these issues and reached a bargain. The bargain was that Iran would suspend its uranium enrichment activities, which are legal within the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it would suspend them. And in return, Europe would provide firm guarantees on security issues. I'm quoting, firm guarantees on security issues. That means on U.S.-Israeli threats to attack Iran, which are very credible threats. So Europe would provide firm guarantees on that. Well, Europe refused to discuss that, probably under U.S. pressure. And after some period, after Europe backed off from its side of the bargain, Iran backed off from its side, started enriching uranium again. There are other questions. All of this indicates clear paths that could be pursued to mitigating and probably solving whatever problem there is about the Iranian uranium enrichment. And it goes beyond. I mean, it is well understood among strategic analysts, just unanimously, that the major concern, and in fact it's a concern that leads all the way to the human survival, is to put control of a production of fissile materials for nuclear materials that can be used for power, for weapons, to put production of fissile materials under some form of international control. That actually was proposed several years ago by Mohammed al-Barad, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Put them under international control. Then any state that wants to use such materials for peaceful purposes would apply to the international agency, and under appropriate guarantees would be able to use them for nuclear power. That's a critical decision. It actually, something similar came to the United Nations. It was voted over U.S. objections. The United Nations did consider a similar proposal. It's called a Fissile Materials Cutoff Treaty. Similar. In November 2004, the vote was 147 to 1, United States. There were 2 abstentions. One was Israel, which reflexively has to go along with the United States. The other was more interesting. It was Britain. The British ambassador explained at the UN session that Britain supported the treaty, but could not support this version of it because it was dividing the international community, namely dividing it 147 to 1. Therefore, Britain's Blair decided that preserving the safety of the human species is insignificant as compared with making sure you shine the master's boots. Well, that's that. Incidentally, the media didn't report it. They don't report these things. But these are general proposals that the world's in favor of outside the United States and its British client. But they're dead in the water. And as long as the U.S. doesn't accept them, they're not going to get anywhere. In fact, to my knowledge, there's only one country that has accepted al-Baradei's proposal. That's Iran. Last February, they announced that, yes, they would accept it. Well, that would not only end this crisis, but it would end a much greater crisis, namely the threat of production of fissile material by states, which is almost, you'd be pretty confident that's going to lead to a major nuclear war, probably destruction of the species. But they're the only country that I know of that's accepted it. And that wasn't reported in the media either. But without continuing, there are ways to deal with this crisis, such as it is, if there is any intention of dealing with it. If the intention is to use it as an excuse to overthrow the government of Iran, well, then all of this, everything we're saying is beside the point. In fact, the U.S. has been committed to overthrowing the government of Iran ever since 1979, without a break. That's why the U.S. and Britain and others supported Saddam Hussein's murderous attack on Iran, pure aggression supported by the U.S. and Britain, with use of chemical weapons, killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians and so on. Iran finally had to capitulate because the U.S. entered the war directly. In 1988, at that point, Iran realized it can't fight the United States, so it essentially capitulated. But through the 80s and then on through the 90s, with heavy sanctions and others, and subversion, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the government. And we all understand why, if we stop to think for a moment. In 1953, the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary government in Iran and installed the Shah. It was one of the brutal tyrant, hideous human rights record. But he was a loyal ally, so they supported him. Well, in 1979, the Iranian people overthrew him. That is an intolerable act. You cannot overthrow a tyrant imposed by U.S. power. It's against the rules. And ever since then, the U.S. has been seeking in one or another way to overturn the government of Iran. Actually, they're harming the reformers. I mean, there are plenty of great pressure for reform inside Iran, and that's being harmed by U.S. Aggressiveness and hostility. You can read, in fact, an op-ed about this this morning. I think it's in the Boston Globe by an Iranian, one of the leaders in the Iranian reform movement, and a woman and an American specialist on Afghanistan. But that's well understood. I mean, Iranian reform leaders have been pleading with the United States not to strengthen the government by hostile and aggressive actions. It was just strengthens the ruling government, which could collapse from within if they were left alone. But it depends. But the U.S. doesn't want Iranians to rule Iran any more than it wants Iraqis to rule Iraq. It wants to be in a position of domination and control, and Britain follows loyally behind. So yes, they probably will press this issue towards a serious confrontation, which could be extremely dangerous. However, there are ways out, and it's easy to understand what they are. Call off the hostile threats, which are virtually instructing Iran to develop a deterrent, just as North Korea did, under hostile threat. Call off the hostile threats, deal with security issues, live up to the bargain that Europe made, do something about the much larger question control of fissile material production in the first place. It should be pretty much along the lines that Albarrade suggested, or that were proposed in the UN, the treaty that the UN voted 147 to 1 with the U.S. and Britain opposed.